because of our history of conflict between these faiths, I just want to point out that this is a weaponized border. It is a kind of militarized border between these faiths, because at another time, for centuries and centuries, throughout Christian history, one would not be free to say anything positive about the Prophet Muhammad. You could be curious, but if you got your hands as a Christian on a Quran and said something positive, you would be in jail. And that's important to remember, that throughout Christendom, throughout so many centuries, interfaith dialogue was simply not possible. It was not, there wasn't this kind of freedom. And so I celebrate that we have a much greater freedom now. It's interesting that Craig takes a humanistic approach, so we even have to be grateful for the whole humanistic tradition, including our agnostic and atheist friends who have opened up this space that's more neutral, where even this dialogue now can be seen and can be conceptualized in a way that it couldn't when everyone in the world was hyper-religious and religion was required. Everything was so tight then, and now we have a greater freedom. But even so, it takes a lot of courage to step across these boundaries. Craig is a brave leader intellectually, and he definitely receives a lot of threats, a lot of negative flack, and a lot of gratitude and thanks from Muslims. He's very popular with the Muslim community, but less so with some of our Christian brothers and sisters, which has been my experience too, speaking out on these same issues. So I would like to share a little bit some of the ideas that I've been working on alongside Craig, alongside a small minority of Christian scholars who are trying to turn the tide and trying to create a new paradigm of cooperation, respect, love between these two faiths. And not just between these two faiths, because we also want to see peace between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, a lot more respect there, and between really all the religions of planet Earth. So for me and my work, it's just such an interesting contrast, as Shaheen was beginning to point out, some of the obvious and kind of incredible virtues of Muhammad. Obviously, as the founder of what is becoming the largest world religion that humanity has ever known, the largest religion, who has created such a foundation for societies to thrive. But in Christian history, soon after Islam emerged, Christian thinkers began to develop demonizing rhetoric that would create, like I said, this weaponized boundary, this very harsh boundary between the faiths. Are folks aware of this history? Who knows some of this history?
I don't think so. Go ahead.
You go back to the 7th century. John of Damascus was a very popular author, and he wrote an extensive book called Against Heresies, where he refutes every single, what he called heresies, which are kind of like innovations, which are kind of differences within the Christian tradition. So he was attacking numerous different Christian sects, one by one, with a righteous vitriol that was very popular back then. And he's very articulate and smart and so forth, and he still has made some interesting theological contributions, but he was the one who began to popularize the idea that Muhammad was a false prophet, inspired by the devil, and so forth. And that really became, a central Christian critique of Islam, to say he claims to be a prophet, but he's not. He's a false prophet. So then he's not inspired by God. He's inspired by the devil, and then the whole thing is rotten. And that's an idea that, sadly, was very popular within Christianity, not only from John of Damascus, but authors such as Thomas Aquinas, Martin Luther. Major figures within the Christian tradition also continue to advance this attack. The problem with this kind of rhetoric, which could be obvious, but it is dehumanizing. It really, by dehumanizing Muhammad and really desacralizing his beautiful work, then you're really, in a representative way, dehumanizing all Muslims. You're really dehumanizing, desacralizing everything they're doing, and really, creating this dynamic where Christians who believe such things will not trust Muslims. They will not want to cooperate with them. If there's any kind of disagreement, they're not going to trust that they're going to get to an ethical place. They're going to be predisposed towards hating and not seeing Muslims as human. And this is the toxicity of this kind of belief. In today's world, you are still going to find Christians saying this. The politics are different, so you might not find as much as explicit. But the thing is, Christians, I believe, have a duty because we're inheriting this karma, we're inheriting this negative energy, we're carrying it within our tradition. So I don't believe it's enough to just say, well, now we're going to stop saying that. And we're just going to start to say something kind of like, well, we worship the same God and tie it back to Abraham. It's like, yeah, but when for 1,000 years you say Muhammad's inspired by the devil, you need to do better because you've created so much negative energy, and it is still going. It is still going within Christian communities. And other forms of hate get carried by culture like that. So in this case, I've been looking at this, and Craig obviously has shown us, here is a way for Christians to appreciate the Prophet Muhammad. Here's a way for us to acknowledge that he's a prophet. For Christians, that seems radical because they're so conditioned to hate Muhammad. They're so conditioned to see him as a false prophet. It's sad, but it's true. Even though if you looked at it objectively, it wouldn't really be that much of a stretch to acknowledge the prophet of one of the major world religions. And Christians don't do this to Buddhism. They're not saying, oh, Buddha, oh no. So they're not having that issue. They're not saying it about Moses, and they're really not attacking Confucius or Lao Tzu. They're not doing that, but because of the history of competition, because of the way this conflict has developed between Christians and Muslims, this is where we're at. And so my belief, what Craig does in this book, and what I think we have to also articulate more explicitly in the theological space, is to really make the case for the prophethood of Muhammad in a very respectful way. For me, part of it is to develop some of the ideas so that Christians can also, make this, which I don't think is a very extravagant or extraordinary claim. It seems that way. But how can Christians also stand in their own faith, not feel afraid that their whole identity is going to be annihilated if they admit that Muhammad's a prophet and that Islam's a real religion, which is like, well, it's, which seems like kind of absurd because they're both the two largest religions in the world, but it's similar to other problems, other insanities that we see of humanity, such as men acknowledging the humanity of women. Been very hard for men to acknowledge the humanity of women, even though it's half of humanity. And it's been hard for white people to acknowledge the humanity of people of other races. So we know that humans tend to make very gross errors in their judgment of others. And this is one of them. So one of the ways I've been working on this is, first of all, just to try to popularize the idea that as a Christian, you could accept Muhammad as a prophet. Why? Because it's common sense. First of all, it's just common sense. It's respect. It's respect for your Muslim brothers and sisters. Why would you assume not? And then also, it's to correct these terrible errors from the past. And then also, it's in the Bible. So I kind of go that way too, and that's where I get into most hot water with my evangelical colleagues. So like, well, you can't take away our mean Bible. I'm like, well, maybe it's more open than you think. You know, so if you look in the Gospel of John, one of my favorite Gospels, it's different than all the rest of the Gospel versions, because there's 4 versions. The Gospel of John comes last, and the author of the Gospel of John is grappling with the fact that he's the last living disciple of Jesus. At the end of the Gospel especially, this becomes a major theme because the early Jesus followers believed that he would be back soon. So there was a very popular belief in an imminent second coming, that Jesus would be, come out of the clouds with a choir, an army of angels, crush the Romans and establish justice and just make everything good. So early Christians were really into that. Now, they were the poorest of the poor. They were struggling under Roman rule, and they believed that the end was near. And then, 10 years passed, 30 years passed, 40 years passed. The author of the Gospel of John starts to write down his final teachings, because the oral tradition needs to be preserved. And he's like, I'm the only one left. And Jesus didn't quite say he would definitely be back. He said, what if I would be back? So he's kind of dealing with this, grappling with this. And within that context, he talks about a couple of things. But he talks about, the abiding presence of the Holy Spirit, which is very important for Christian theology. This idea that God is present and Christians are staying connected with Jesus as well through a spiritual presence. And then I argue that he's also talking just about a future prophet, because the timeline expands and they no longer have an imminent eschatology. They now have a much more extended idea of what the future holds. So if you go in John chapter 15, Jesus says, when the advocate comes, who I will send to you from the Father, the Spirit of truth who comes from the Father, he will testify on my behalf. You also are to testify because you have been with me from the beginning. I look at that text and I'm like, this could fit for Muhammad, this advocate who will be sent in the future and who will, speak out on behalf of the truth. And Christians are going to speak out too, because they've been there. And maybe there's a way that Christians and Muslims are going to speak out together and talk about social justice and talk about equality and talk about all these values that we share, which is really my vision for a more collaborative, cooperative way that our faiths could be. And then he also has this phrase further in chapter 16, where he tells his followers, this is before shortly before he'll be killed. I still have many things to say to you, but you cannot bear them now. When the Spirit of truth comes, he will guide you into all the truth, for he will not speak on his own, but will speak whatever he hears, and he will declare to you the things that are to come. He will glorify me because he will take what is mine and declare it to you. All that the Father has is mine. For this reason I said that he will take what is mine and declare it to you. So many of my Christian colleagues don't want to hear this. They're like, strictly speaking, Jesus only promised the Holy Spirit, and it would strictly remain only within our Christian community. We have a trademark, we have a copyright on this. No one else is going to get any ounce of inspiration. God's strictly going to deliver it only to our community. But what I see in this gospel and what is an openness that, hey, we don't know what God is going to do next. God is going to send the truth down, pay attention, and you're going to learn something new. You're going to learn something more than even what Jesus said. You know, in this scripture, he's saying, you just can't get it all now. So there'll need to be future prophets. There'll need to be more revelations, and God will continue to speak. And I like this passage because, you know, as a way to kind of get a theological embrace of Muhammad, because you could say there's this real connection where Jesus is saying, you know, all the truth, you know, even truths that I knew, even truths that I experienced and kind of in my communion with God, but I just couldn't share them all with you because of your limits. And, you know, in a future prophet, a future prophet will gather truth from this same universal source. And because you're maybe more advanced, you'll be able to learn something more. And that's, you know, a truth of how prophecy really works, I believe, is that, you know, there's so much truth, but whatever is going to be revealed is what we're really ready for in our consciousness at any time. And that's why as people we have to keep growing. We have to keep you know, living up to the light that we have and then hoping that more will be revealed. And so this is just one proof text I use. It doesn't prove, but what it does is it shows us that Christians can be open. We don't have to have beliefs that support a supremacy. Also, Muslims have to work on this. Most religions have to work on this problem of supremacy, where you think that your group is superior. We really need to embrace an openness. I think Craig, you know, in this book has just laid out a really beautiful, accurate description of the prophet. So what we really will want to see happen is we want to see this kind of information into the hands of Christians. I think that's very important. I do think we have more of kind of a theological or argumentative kind of task to really make the case to Christians for why they need to pay attention to this. Why is it important for us to make peace with Muslims? And just to kind of tie it all into what's happening in our world today, there is a theory that we won't have peace among nations until we have peace between religions, peace and understanding and dialogue. And when you look at the world, in human culture, religions are the base level of human culture. They're the most enduring cultural forms, and they're the largest cultural forms, and they unite people across many different nations. Structures like nations don't last as long as religions, and they have, you know, a powerful influence over law and behavior, but they don't have as powerful influence even over consciousness and over the way people feel as religions do. Which is why most nations, if they want to have a war, they need the religion behind it. It's hard for them to have a conflict well if they don't have that deeper validation from the religious systems. So when you have, for example, with Christianity and Islam, about 1/3 of humanity are in each of these faiths. So if you have these deep patterns of distrust, of hatred, of competition, you're creating this negative energy, and you're predisposing so many billions of people to be in conflict. If we can shift this, and because you're a Christian, you are more likely to trust a Muslim. You're more likely to have a meaningful dialogue with a Muslim. Because you're Christian, because it's part of your Christianity, you learn to appreciate the Prophet Muhammad. You learn to see that Muslims have a way of touching into the divine source, have many ways. And so when Christians and Muslims come together in a different theological picture and with different ideas, they'd say, oh, we're having a conflict, but we trust that they have this integrity. We trust that they could dig deep and connect with God, and we can connect with God, and we could talk together about, what's the best way to, deal with a water shortage, or deal with a border dispute, or deal with any of the other problems that, humanity has to face. And so I believe we do have a responsibility, and we have a really great opportunity in terms of peacemaking to just take down the temperature, take down the violent rhetoric, look at the beliefs in our traditions critically, the ones that cause demonization of the other, the ones that inspire hatred and mistrust. We all have them within our faiths, and we have to think about, why are we holding them? Where were they formed? Was there a war with our faith and another faith? Even within Islam, there's Shia and Sunni. So, there are so many ways that we can look deeply into our faiths and try to say, how can we resolve these issues? How can we find beliefs that when we hold them, we see the beauty of the other person? Those are the lenses we should be building within our faiths, not these distorted, dehumanizing lenses. Those should be removed. And we should instead, not even neutral, but develop the positive beliefs. The positive beliefs that create connection, that create flow, that help us find that synergy where even though we're going to have different religions, we're going to have a way of connecting spiritually. We're going to have a way of having that deep, deep synergy that then becomes the basis for a cooperative international order, cooperative business, cooperative culture. But we really we have to do that deep spiritual work to create those connections. And it's not going to be by getting everyone to believe the same thing. It's just never going to happen that way. It's going to be through that respect. It's going to be through beliefs like Christians saying, the Prophet Muhammad, who did this amazing thing, who gave us this wonderful teaching that we now sprinkle in and bring in, and who taught us this tradition, and now we're getting more into fasting because we're learning from Muslims, and things like that just create those feelings of like trust and love and admiration. We really want to learn that. Neutrality between faiths is really just not enough. It's really just a cop-out. And it's especially not enough because of what we inherit, which is so negative. You really can't just end with neutrality. We have to go far beyond. Craig's done it, and I think others, let's be so brave to do it and to contradict, the errors, to contradict the errors of our own traditions. It's not easy. And I got called into some meetings after writing these articles. They said, well, are you saying, one of my bosses was like, I don't know if you're going to be able to stay in this association after that article you wrote because, people are concerned. They're like, well, are you saying Muhammad is God? I'm like, no, I didn't say that. I'm just saying Muslims are our brothers and sisters. They have a true religion. How could it not be a true religion? It's like the biggest religion out there. What do you mean? They're like, it's reasonable. So it was interesting. Talking with my colleagues, they accepted it. And it was only a little bump in the road. They didn't take away my fancy scarf, so I'm still here. And other Christian colleagues, I want to encourage them to just, rabble-rouse. And, it's like similar to, being in a sexist context and saying something wonderful about, women. It's like, whoa, that's bold, It's the same kind of thing, or saying something anti-racist in a context where a lot of people are racist. It's like, do it. Step out and let people see it for what it is. It's not, we can't hide hate behind, cherished beliefs. Well, I've been saying it for so long. Who cares? It's still wrong. So with that, I want to thank you, Shaheen. Thanks everyone for being here. And I hope some of these words were helpful.